Shall the youth of Zion falter
in defending truth and right?
Will the enemy assaileth?
Shall we shrink or shun the fight?
No. True to the faith that our parents have cherished. True to the truth for which martyrs have perished. To God's command, soul, heart, and hand, faithful and true we will ever stand.
This is Infants on Thrones, the philosophies of men mingled with humor. We are the Quorum.
Welcome back to Infants on Thrones. I'm Glenn Ostland, and this is episode 584, Sarcasm and the Healing Power of Humor. Now, a few weeks ago, I was approached by Wendi Jensen, who I first met about a year and a half ago. Wendi is the author of the book, A Peculiar Transition, Healing the Trauma of a Mormon Faith Crisis. Wendi also works as a life coach who helps both active Mormons and transitioning Mormons to navigate all those weird little changes that happen with a faith crisis. Now, Wendi asked me if she could interview me about the role that humor has played in my life, in my own exit from Mormonism, so that's what you're going to hear today. Now, you can find Wendi online at www.thrivingaftermormonism.com, or you can email her at wendy@wendyjensen.com, and that's Wendi with an I, WENDI at Wendi Jensen, JENSEN.com. And of course, you can always shoot me an email if you want at infantsonthrones@gmail.com. So here's our conversation. I hope you enjoy it.
Hello, I am so grateful to have Glenn Ostland here with us today, and we're going to talk about some of his transitioning experiences. But the reason I wanted to invite him is because he does a podcast called Infants on Thrones. And this podcast, when I first listened to it, I thought, oh my gosh, it's so sarcastic and it's so harsh towards the church.
Of all the blessings that have come, the best thing in my life is the companionship and comfort I get from very young men. I'm too sexy for wickedness, too sexy for wickedness. It never was happiness.
I was really a little bit offended when I was still a little baby coming in, as just barely emerging out of church. And then I popped onto another podcast. I'm like, wow, these are some good points. But the more I listened to it, the more I started resonating, and I started to have a little bit of a shift myself as far as how we can use sarcasm as kind of a healing mechanism and a healing for what happens to us during the trauma of faith crisis and faith transition. So I know that Glenn has some valuable information that we can use as we are learning to start thriving after Mormonism. So Glenn, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Welcome, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. So I've been podcasting in the ex-Mormon space for about 9.5 years now.
Wow.
So I started, I think it was probably January 2010, sometime around there. It might have been 2009. I don't really remember. But I did some things with Mormon Expression for a while and became quite a regular on Mormon Expression, and then had some creative differences with John Larson, and a little bit after that started Infants on Thrones, and that's been going for nearly 7 years. Yeah, I think that was 2012. June 2012 is when we recorded our first episode. It wasn't published until August of 2012. But anyway, and it was me and 5 of my friends, all guys, all rowdy, obnoxious. They swore a lot more than I did. Like I didn't swear, I was always really kind of skittish with that. I've loosened up and I swear quite a bit now. It's just kind of become second nature to me in some cases, but it took a while. And so at the beginning of that podcast, we're trying to figure out who our listeners were and what they could stomach and what we needed to edit or not. And we went back and forth on a couple of things. And at some point I just went, we're just going to be who we are. And it's going to, people are going to have the reaction like you had. It's either going to be too much for them, or it's going to be just what they need, or, Yeah. So I've been doing that for 7 years, and it's changed quite a bit over the years. It's kind of slowed down a bit. We've moved most of the episodes over to like paid subscription stuff on Patreon, and there's a small group of about 300 people there, but still release a main episode out to the general public, maybe 1 or 2 of those a month.
That's awesome. So tell me a little bit about yourself, Glenn. Like, what is your 2-minute version of how you grew up?
2 minutes. I grew up in Arizona. I'm the oldest of 3 children. Totally loved the church growing up. I loved all of the deep doctrine and speculation and the Bruce R. McConkie and the Nibley, and that was kind of the relationship that I had with my dad. We don't really have a lot in common. We never really had a lot in common growing up, except the church stuff. And he was the kind of guy that would read pseudepigrapha and look for all of these clues like you were putting together. Do you remember one of the very first video games that I remember playing that came out on PC was something called Myst, and in Myst you had to solve. It was almost like what are those things called, like a panic room, or those places that you can go to where you're trying to solve puzzles to get out of the room. It was that kind of an idea. It's like
escape room. Yeah,
escape room. That's what it is. So Myst was kind of like a game like that. And that's what Mormonism was in some ways. There's all of these clues, all these different pieces that you could put together to figure out the eternal perspective and stuff. So that was a lot of the appeal of Mormonism to me. I went on a mission to Japan from 1991 to 93. And when I got back, I was at BYU trying to figure out what to do. And I got interested in folklore. And so I spent 1.5 years at BYU working in the BYU folklore archives, which was really interesting. And then I decided to get a advanced degree in folklore. So I went to Indiana University, where they offer a master's degree and a PhD. And for my master's thesis, I wrote about the lost tribes of Israel and Japan, because that was a big legend cycle in my mission. And for my dissertation, I wrote about Mormon humor. I didn't finish my dissertation. I got an opportunity to work for a medical device company midway through, and I took that instead of finishing the academic route. So I never finished the dissertation. I never finished my PhD, but it was on humor. And so the question that you have about the role that sarcasm plays, I can tell you there's my mentor at BYU was a man named William A. Wilson. A stands for Albert. He went by a nickname Bert for people who knew him really well. So Bert Wilson wrote a lot about Mormon folklore, and he wrote some about Mormon humor. And he's got a really good article if people want to look it up, William A. Wilson. And I forget the title of it off the top of my head, but just look up Mormon humor. And one of the things that he references in there is that there's some, you can't stereotype Mormons, to think that every Mormon is going to be exactly the same or respond the same to certain things. And so there's some that have a high tolerance for humor and jokes, and some who don't. And the guess, or what they were speculating, is that it has a lot to do with how emotionally attached you are to the subject matter that's being joked.
Yes.
And so if you're really, really emotionally attached and somebody's poking a stick, sarcastic, sarcasm, I learned as I was doing my dissertation, comes from a Greek word that actually means to rip off the flesh.
Oh,
sarcasm. So it's like a really violent style of communicating, being facetious, not saying what you really mean, but kind of doing it, in this really kind of sharp way. And so if people are very closely connected to the subject matter, they don't want that ripped away. They don't want that cut away. They don't want it poked at. They don't want it made fun of, nothing. But if you've got some distance from it, then you can maybe step back and appreciate, because a lot of what humor is about is recognizing incongruities or recognizing a sense of superiority. There's all kinds of theories why something is funny. And so I started thinking of humor and sarcasm as almost a wedge that you could use to create separation, like emotional distance between yourself and the subject matter. And so I think that's really the question that you have for me is, how does sarcasm separate you or help you when you're going through a transition, help you create a space for healing? I think it creates that emotional distance between you and the subject matter. And there's so many of those, so many strings that we're attached to culturally, growing up Mormon.
I have an example.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a friend you remember when Napoleon Dynamite came out?
Yes.
I just thought that was the funniest thing. I could watch it over and over. Now I watch it and I'm like, I don't see what was so funny now. But at the time, I just would bust a gut, when watching him dance on stage, putting tater tots in his pocket. But I had a friend come over, like, you got to come over. Have you seen Napoleon Dynamite? No, and she's in her mid-30s, and she comes over to watch Napoleon Dynamite. And she's like, can we turn this off? It was upsetting her so much. And then she shared with me about her high school experience, and she was like, Napoleon Dynamite. So
she grew up in like a rural Idaho place that
and so she was like, this isn't funny for me, and we shouldn't make fun of those people. And and so that's a good example of if you're really that enmeshed in Mormon culture, and then you have somebody kind of attack all the kind of incongruencies and make light of our arrogance and the superiority and the incongruence with how we claim to be like Christ, but yet we're so far over on the other side, and it hurts. It is painful, and it feels disrespectful because we've made those things so holy to us. So
I think it forces you to examine something as being other, like being separate from you. And if you don't want it to be separate from you, and you don't really want to examine it critically, it is kind of a painful experience. One of the things that I did when I was gathering data for my dissertation, I had a collection of about 35 humorous stories or jokes, and I would read them. I would get together small groups of people from my ward, maybe 3 or 4 and I'd read the jokes to them. And then we'd talk about them when they were over, and I'd ask them to rate each one. Do you think this was, very funny, not funny, or offensive? There was some kind of a scale like that. And I had one experience that really, I had aspirations at the time of teaching at BYU. I really liked going to BYU. I really liked the BYU folklore archives. I wanted to teach BYU students about their culture, the traditions that make a Mormon. And as I was writing this dissertation and I was looking at the way that people in my ward in Bloomington, Indiana were responding to these things, I started realizing I'm going to be saying things that are very different than what they're saying. The observations that I'm making about what's going on are very different and might be really difficult and challenging and offensive to some. And the best example I have for that, I was talking to a former bishop, former stake president. I think he and his wife had just gotten back from their second mission, and it was with them and then their older daughter, who was a couple years older than me actually, and I think like their 16-year-old granddaughter or something. And I told him this joke, and I don't remember all the details, but it was something like there's a bishopric that goes camping, and they're talking about what I see. I remember what it was. The bishop says, when I'm out here in nature, I'm sorry guys, I can't help it. I've got to have a nice cold beer. And he reaches into his ice chest, he pulls out a beer and he starts drinking it. And then he looks at the first counselor like, what are you going to do? And the first counselor goes, yeah, well, Bishop, when I'm out in nature, I really enjoy smoking a cigar. And he reaches into his bag and pulls out a cigar and he lights it up. And he looks at the second counselor, and the second counselor goes, yeah, well, when I'm out in nature, I really need to brew a nice fresh cup of coffee. And so he brings, this coffee. And then they look at the executive secretary. They're all staring at him. And he goes, well, Yeah. I have a vice too. I'm a terrible gossip, and I can't wait to get back to the ward and tell everybody what you said. And so, like how you just laughed, like
Yeah.
that response, that's what I was interested in recording.
Yeah,
So,
because
like,
it's like an unspoken thing that we all know is there.
it's
It's
this,
like the substance of comedians, you
right.
know?
It's this automatic response that you're like, you're doing something, you're responding. And so this former stake president, he did the same thing. He laughed a bit harder than you did, actually. Really, really laughed. And so then when I said, okay, was it very funny, not funny, or offensive? He goes, yeah, that's not funny. And I'm thinking, but you laughed. So what does that mean? So explain to me why it's not funny. He goes, well, because I've been a bishop. I know a lot of bishops. They're good people. It really shouldn't be made fun of. In fact, change my answer to offensive. Yeah, change it to offensive. So he wasn't really talking about what was. He was talking about what should be, which tells me that, there's just too much emotional distance for him to be able to put these things under a microscope and study them and analyze them and look at them with any kind of subjectivity. And not that I would be able to be much more subjective, because I was still a faithful attending Mormon. I just had a little bit more emotional distance to be able to talk about cultural things than other people.
So I have a question with that. First, it's an observation. I mean, do you think that, his response being a natural and authentic laugh, we don't laugh when we're offended. We get hurt. And so it's almost like you can observe him reorder his emotion to fit into the paradigm.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's like a conditioning that happens until I do this natural thing, this organic thing that happens, but I notice that it's not in alignment with the agreed upon narrative, and so I got to scoot it until it feels like it's in alignment. And I think that a lot of the unpacking we do when we are transitioning out of the church is recognizing that we can literally be authentic all the time, and it's something we have to practice because we're conditioned to shut that off and align, shut it off and align. But the further we step away from the church, it's almost like we're free to be ourselves, and we're not using that crazy mechanism. We don't even know where we learned it, but we're not participating in it anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's even an interesting question when you're talking about being yourself. I mean, what does that mean? Because there are certain boxes that you're supposed to check. There are certain things that you're supposed to conform to. And for some people, it's easier to conform to that than others. Is that really yourself? If you've conformed to this thing, is it really yourself? Or do you have inclinations or propensities to do something different? Do you allow yourself to do that? When I was still, and I don't want to talk for everybody who's left the church, so I'll just say for me, and I really believed very strongly that Heavenly Father was always watching me. There were always angels above me, silent notes taking, and there was nothing that I did that was beyond or above scrutiny. And so I think about this stake president who might have thought, oh yeah, that's funny. And then went, oh gosh, I'm being judged for this right now by these angels who are silent notes taking. Oh, he laughed at that. He shouldn't have. And so he backtracks really, really quickly.
Get back in line.
I think he should be, but, and so for me, when that started dropping away and I started going, okay, well, maybe I am alone in my thoughts. Maybe there's not a God. Then who am I going to be? Am I going to be, then what are my standards? Are my standards, or are they other people's standards that I'm trying to conform to? And that, I mean, I think that's still a journey, I think that's something that's still ongoing, learning how to do that. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I love what you've said there. It's definitely something to study. And I love that sarcasm and just being able to laugh at ourselves. I think being able to laugh at your own, silliness is healing, because at first it really hurts, and how I treated people when I was in the church, and how I looked down on people, and how I just positioned myself in such a superior way, not knowing that I was doing that,
Yeah.
But now, and then briefly after I left, I was like, this hurt. It pains me that I acted like that. It hurts me that I was so condescending and mean to people. And so there was a pain. And now I can look back at it and know that, that was my Mormon self, and I think it's funny and I'm okay with it. But it's just kind of it's an emergence, a transition. And it is finding myself. And it's unpacking who I was told to be and giving myself permission to just be this natural person inside, which is my first and organic inclination when I experience something.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think being able to laugh at yourself, that's really important to me. To try to keep myself in check so that I'm never taking myself too seriously. I don't know. I don't know why that's important to me. It's just really important to me to be able to have that perspective and admit my own foibles and be able to laugh at my foibles. I think there's some acceptance that's in there instead of feeling like, I don't know, that like guilt and shame for things you can laugh at it. And that you could probably still laugh at yourself and still feel shameful. That's part of that ongoing process, I think, as well.
But I think sincerely finding yourself joyfully funny in all of your faux pas and all of your idiosyncrasies and all of your crazy little dumb stuff that you do that's embarrassing to you, and being able to laugh at it instead of deliver self-contempt, I think is powerful. It's a transition, it's a maturity, and it's an adult development skill that no one teaches us.
Yeah.
It kind of emerges as we go through life and we make a commitment to give ourselves permission to differentiate and to.
Yeah.
So I
had kind of a shift about a year ago. I haven't really thought about this, Wendi. So this might be a little rough. You can help me work through this. But a little over a year ago, I was reading something that was talking about self-deprecating humor and how damaging that actually is.
Yeah.
So there's ways where humor can be really healthy. I think there's ways where humor can be really destructive. And if you've got a certain view of yourself that is, you're not loving yourself, you're not accepting yourself, you're really, really critical, and you're always putting yourself down, and that's part of your sarcasm. I don't know that that's really the most healthy thing. You're always in a state then of insecurity, and you're just reinforcing that insecurity with, and kind of using humor as a mask, or that sarcasm,
or shield, a protection of I'm going to point out everything that's wrong with me before you do, kind of thing.
And when I've thought about like, why do I do things like that? When I do that, why do I do it? And it's usually because I think that someone else is thinking that about me, and I want to beat them to the punch.
Yeah.
So that they can see, oh, he's actually quite enlightened. He recognizes that he's being an idiot right now.
Self-aware.
Right. So he's so self-aware, when really most of the time I think I'm putting that idea into people's heads.
Yeah, they weren't even
thinking about that at all.
Yeah.
I was. And so it just doesn't really, I've really tried to find that balance between having a healthy sense of, self-humor without being deprecating, without cutting myself down. And I still don't know exactly where that line is, but I think that's a line that's important to try and find.
So some other questions here.
Yeah.
When you were studying this folklore, what would be your take on the Book of Mormon as a piece of literature?
The Book of Mormon as a piece of literature?
Yeah. Or do you categorize it as something as folklore? How have you rated the Book of Mormon? What is the Book of Mormon to you?
Okay. Well, what the Book of Mormon is to me is a story that Joseph Smith told. And I mentioned the word pseudepigrapha before. Pseudepigrapha is when someone writes in the style of scripture, in the voice of a prophet, like this is the lost book of Moses or the lost book of Zedekiah, or something like that. Zenos. There's these pseudepigraphal books that were written way after these people actually supposedly lived. And it gets passed off as scripture. To me, that's what the Book of Mormon is. And Joseph Smith was I think, showing through the Book of Mormon that God isn't dead, the Bible isn't closed, Revelation continues, people can have a connection with the divine. I think that's what it kind of grew into. I think what it grew out of was his treasure-seeking, the intrigue that people had about the Native Americans and the connection to Israel, because that was fairly well-known part of folklore in that day and age.
Yeah.
Joseph Smith and the Mormons weren't the first ones that thought of the Native Americans as having ties to the lost tribes of Israel. That happened long before Mormonism came around.
Oh.
And so trying to tell a story that would be compelling and that would explain Israelite origins of the Native Americans, and maybe influenced by some of these books that you hear talked about. I don't remember the names of them off the top of my head. But so I wouldn't consider it folklore, because folklore is usually anonymous in its authorship. And the authorship of folklore, it's usually like created by a community or a group. Like everybody has a little say into how this is shaped, and it exists in multiple variations. So there's different versions of it, and it's more orally transmitted than written down, although folklorists now look at things like Xerox lore. And I say now, but it's been 15 years, almost 20 years since I was in the academic study of folklore, so I'm not sure. I haven't kept up on how folklorists are thinking of things like this now. But I wouldn't consider the Book of Mormon to be folklore. I would just consider it to be a work of art from Joseph Smith that's in the tradition of pseudepigrapha.
So what I'm hearing is like it was his translation of spiritual thoughts that he was having in kind of the arena in which he was studying, because there's so many books. It's kind of almost a remix, but it's amalgamated with his own thoughts of spirituality and the cosmos and everything.
Yeah, or you could call it Bible fan fiction. He grew up with the stories of the Bible, and that was something that his family would read all the time, and he would sit by the fire and listen to his mom read and his brothers, and like they would all read the Bible and come together through that. And he's like, I want to do this. I've got some ideas. I've heard some stories. I'm creative. And so that's what I think that the Book of Mormon is.
Well, I noticed even some of his Doctrine and Covenants pieces about the spirit world and the nature of spirits have a lot to do with Swedenborg's work. That was, prior to his work, that would absolutely be available to him at the time.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting how he's just figuring out, and his ability to create stories and articulate.
Yeah. I think of Joseph Smith as a mystic more than a con man. I know a lot of ex-Mormons like to think of him as a con man. I don't really think of him as a con man. I think of him as a mystic. And Swedenborg was a mystic. I got a Swedenborg book a while ago, and I tried to, I think it was called Of Heaven and Hell. It was so dry. I just couldn't, I'm like, I really want to get these connections to Joseph Smith. That lasted like maybe 10 or 15 minutes. I just couldn't listen to the audiobook anymore. I couldn't read it. I'm like,
It's heavy. Yeah.
But the Doctrine and Covenant stuff is very different from the Book of Mormon too, as far as like literature and storytelling and narrative and what it actually is.
That's interesting. So what do you think, as far as when you had I forgot to ask you to talk about this in the beginning, but what was your moment of, I don't think this is true kind of thing, where your shelf collapsed and you're like, okay,
it's hard to say. I didn't have like a big moment. It kind of creeped up on me.
Mm-hmm.
There were several small moments, and it probably started on my mission around my own ambition to be a zone leader or an AP, And then I started seeing in other people their ambitions to be zone leaders and APs and how it made them do some kind of despicable things. And then I started seeing, oh, am I doing that too? Am I going to be one of those kind of cutthroat people that status, like, this is really important to me? And so I started getting jaded because I started seeing that the principles of charity and love that we were supposedly espousing weren't being applied in every area. And this is before Prop 8, I mean, we're talking about like 91, 92, 93
Yeah.
on my mission. And then when I started studying folklore and I started learning more about what religion is and the role that religion plays in people's lives cross-culturally throughout history, and I could see the similarities in Mormonism. So, for example, there's a guy named Sir James Fraser who wrote a book called The Golden Bough, and The Golden Bough does a lot of comparative mythology from around the world, and he's got a section about magic. And I'm trying to, it's sympathetic magic, which basically means it's a sympathy. It's that things at a distance can have an impact on each other, even though there's a distance between them. They're not touching. And there's two primary branches of sympathetic magic: homeopathic and contagion. And the law of contagion just means that something comes in contact with it, its essence is transferred from one object to another object, and then you've got this kind of like magical essence. Like I've got the guitar pick of John Lennon, and so somehow that's magical because he once touched it.
Yeah.
Or homeopathy is in the sense that James Fraser used it was the similarity. That's what the homeo means, the similarity. So like a voodoo doll, you create it in the image of a person, and then because there's that likeness, that similarity, it can have this sympathetic power over space and time. And so I started learning about these principles, and that Fraser, he would do this cross-cultural analysis of these magical practices or belief systems across cultures, and I started recognizing, that those generalities exist in Mormonism too.
Yeah.
The way that we lay our hands on somebody's head to give a priesthood blessing, and especially as a young man,
transference of power.
there's this transference of power that we even create these priesthood charts that like go back to who was the first person who touched the person that touched you, that touched that person, and it all goes back to Jesus. And so it's that law of contagion that I experienced firsthand. And then you have homeopathy and things like using pure olive oil to represent the purity of pureness. And as a way to, when somebody's sick, you put this consecrated oil on their head to dispel the impurities. And and I started seeing that in the sacrament and just all these different things that we were doing. I started seeing rites of passage that cultures do, where they bring in somebody and to initiate them, they go through some kind of a liminal experience that's like time out of time. This magical transformation takes place, and then they're reintroduced to the group with a new identity. And you see that in marriage ceremonies around the world, graduation ceremonies around the world. You see it in the temple, you see it in baptism, you see it in all of the ordinances that we do. So I just started recognizing these patterns and going, okay, so Mormonism isn't really all that unique like I thought it was unique, like I was told it was unique. It has these parallels, and it just slowly started unraveling. I just started, and then there were things that just didn't make any sense to me. Like I remember getting into an argument with my ex-wife about blessing the kids when they were sick, and I'm like, they're not that sick. And
we'll wait till they're almost dying, then give them a blessing.
Sure, but I mean, they're not that sick. And what, like, you really think that a loving Father in heaven isn't going to want them to be here? Like, a loving Father in heaven is going to wait for me.
Yeah, they're like, well, if you'd bless him, I'd make him better.
Yeah, I would have saved him, but you didn't ask. I don't really believe in that kind of a God. And why would it have to be me? Why couldn't you do it?
Yeah.
Why couldn't you bless the kids?
I haven't had the transference of powers.
Yeah. And so things like this, like God's going to listen to somebody that's that doesn't really make all that sense to me. And so it's just questions like that I was constantly asking. And I was teaching gospel doctrine, and I really wanted to be thorough in my lessons. I remember there was one lesson about the 3 degrees of glory, because we were teaching the Doctrine and Covenants. And so I wanted to go back to the JST that was in Corinthians. And I started reading Corinthians, and I recognized there's a dual structure that's created in 1 Corinthians 15, because it's this question of why is there a resurrection? I think that's really what the chapter is about. And Paul, or whoever the writer is pretending to be Paul, and that says there's life and there's death. There's mortality, there's immortality. There's corruption, there's incorruption. And so it's this binary structure that he's building throughout that chapter. And in one part, he said there's the heavens and then there's the earth. And in the heavens, there's different bodies. There's sun, moon, and stars. And in the earth, there's different types of flesh. There's man and fish and birds and beasts. And I went, okay, well, hang on a second. Sun, moon, and stars are part of the heaven category, which is called celestial, because celestial means the heavens. And the other column is the earthly or terrestrial. So we've really got 2 columns here, the celestial column and the terrestrial column. And the Joseph Smith translation comes in and goes, oh yeah, by the way, there's also a telestial column. Yes. And I went, what? How does that work? And so I went back, I tried to read this dualistic structure with this imagined third category, and it made absolutely no sense to me. Like this was a misunderstanding on Joseph Smith. And I was a graduate student at the time, and I'm thinking, do I understand this better than Joseph Smith did?
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh, wait a second. I've got a lot more education. I live in a day and age where there's a lot more understanding than what Joseph Smith had at the time. And, so it was just a lot of these kinds of things that happened that kind of led me out of the
just
church.
You thinking and thinking and thinking and
thinking and thinking,
matching, and you're like, okay.
Yeah.
there comes a point where there's so much, the collection is too heavy, and you just say, okay, well.
And I also, I'm not the kind of person that does very well being quiet. So if I'm thinking things, I want to share what I'm thinking, and I want to engage people in discussions with it, and not as a way that I want to like railroad them and say, hey, my way of seeing this is the right way. What's wrong with you? Get with the picture. But to say, have you seen this thing about 1 Corinthians with like the dual nature here with terrestrial? What do you make of this? This doesn't make any sense. Can you help me understand this? And nobody, like my bishop couldn't, my dad couldn't, people in the ward could, they just like, sun and moon and stars. I'm like, sun doesn't mean celestial.
That's exactly my experience.
Terrestrial, it's like, so being in church and not being able to really say things the way that I felt about them. Probably the one of the last fast and testimony meetings that I was in, the last time that I bore my testimony in church was November 2010. And I remember it very well because it was after Boyd K. Packer's infamous, why would our lovely Heavenly Father do that to anybody? Just like slamming LGBTQ group. And I was really bothered by that because I had recently learned about a guy that I'd grown up with in my ward who was transgendered. He was born a woman and then he had a sex change, and he was an active member. It was like this big secret in the ward. And I went and I talked with him, and he told me his whole story. And I had so much love in my heart for him, and the struggle that he went through was amazing. And he wouldn't talk about it. He couldn't talk about it because he was afraid that if he crossed the brethren, that when he was resurrected, he'd be resurrected in the body of a woman. And that wasn't, He said, Glenn, have you ever looked through a Halloween mask and you know that people see you differently than you feel on the inside? That's how I've been my entire life. So like that compared with the Boyd K. Packer thing just really crushed me. And so after that conference, our first counselor in the ward got up to kick off fast and testimony meeting. Was, every single conference gets better and better, and everything the brethren have to say is just awesome. And there's some people that they want to pick and choose the things that they like and they don't like, but you can't be a smorgasbord Mormon. It's all or nothing. And I was the first person to get up after he said that. And I went, hang on a second here. Don't talk about me like I'm not here. Like I'm one of these people. We're here in Bloomington, Indiana, where Indiana University is just a stone's throw away. We're getting educated. You're saying that I can't think, that I can't, going back to what we talked about earlier, Wendi, about being yourself. Like, this is myself. This is what I do. I challenge ideas. I take it very seriously, but I want to do it in a playful way. Of course, that's just my personality, but I'm still taking this stuff seriously. And there are things that are said in general conference that I really love, and there are things that I can't stand. And so I told the congregation the story about the transgendered guy, and I did. So I've done episodes on this on Infants on Thrones, these little mini-sodes. I've done them years ago. I've told these stories, but so that's my long-winded question, Wendi, to what was the thing that
what went down? Huh?
There wasn't one. There were lots.
So can you tell me kind of like what's your emotional history as far as what have you watched yourself emerge to from when you started the transition out and you said, okay, it's time for me to stop attending and I need to find myself outside of Mormonism? Like, can you like identify the chronological emotions that you had as you were up into this point? Because there's still probably emotions that are linked to the whole experience.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I don't know that I can package it quite that neatly. I didn't really ever go through an angry phase like a lot of people go through angry phase where they feel like they were lied to. And I think that's because of the way that I understood folklore and the way that I understood tradition, and how, for me, if somebody is inculcated into a false tradition, it's not their fault.
Yeah.
It's just what they believe. And
it
so I was able to give people
that was done to you maliciously.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'll just let you know before you go on.
Yeah.
When I listened to my first Infants on Thrones, I don't even remember which one it was, but I was like, these are just a bunch of angry men.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting that no, you're not angry. You're just
and I mean, it'd be interesting if you went back and listened to that first one to hear my role in that group of guys. And then we did add Heather later, but it was mostly a bunch of guys. And there were some really angry ones and some that would just like, I always felt like I was quite moderate comparatively. There were times where I'd get upset and I'd kind of go railing on something. Mostly I would do it with little quick witty things that I would say to, like stick a knife in something, and like, I don't know. But I never was really angry. I was never really angry at Mormons. I think I was really disappointed in just hypocrisy,
mm-hmm.
and the way that really atrocious attitudes would be draped in the language of love.
Yeah.
Like that's not really love, what you're talking about here. So I could be very strident in my opinions, but I don't know that I was ever really angry. So I'm trying to think though, Wendi, your question about my emotional trajectory. It was so wrapped up in so many things. Like I was not in a good marriage. And the role that the church played in my marriage, where when we would be fighting and I would say, let's pray, let's kneel down side by side and really placate the Lord. I asked the Lord for help. She'd just kind of like roll her eyes and be like, fine. And so we'd do it. And I'd offer up this really sincere, heartfelt prayer. Amen. And then just like right back at the fighting. I'm like, that didn't help. I didn't do anything. And there were so many nights that I would just lay like perched on the edge of my bed with all this like distance as I've got my back to her and she's got her back to me. And I'm thinking to him, where can I turn for peace? Because I'm thinking, oh, I should pray. Well, that never helps. Where can I have peace? And it just became like this haunting hymn. So there was a lot of sadness and despair in that, but that's more from a bad marriage than it is from the church. So it's hard for me to separate that out.
Is there a worry like what's going to happen to my kids? Where do we go from here?
No, I'm not much of a worrier. I always felt like God was a very loving God and things would be worked out. Like people that didn't get baptized when they were supposed to, or maybe their hair floated up in the immersion and nobody caught it. I think God will work it out. We'll be all right. We'll be okay. So I've always kind of had that approach, and I didn't worry about my kids' salvation. I never really worried about hell. I never really worried about like the different degrees of glory, because the way that I thought of the degrees of glory is they're degrees of glory. Even the celestial kingdom is better than what we've got right now. So what's the big deal? Why is everybody running around with the sense of urgency that we've got to do missionary work and save the world? I mean, didn't Jesus do that through the atonement? Isn't that what the good news is, that everybody's been saved? Am I understanding these stories wrong?
Yeah.
So I would say that the most predominant emotion for me as a Mormon was always detachment. I was always a detached observer. I guess. I don't know. There were a lot of times I was frustrated. There were a lot of times where I'd get annoyed that people would do dumb things. But then I just get annoyed with myself for being so judgmental. And that's really why I stopped going to church. I just didn't enjoy it anymore. I was making up excuses to not go. Oh, I'm feeling sick today, honey. Like, oh, again? Yeah. Dump a little bit of hot sauce in the toilet. I threw up, all those kinds of tricks.
So what about your parents informing your family that I don't believe anymore?
Well, with my, because I was doing the podcast, I was doing Mormon Expression and I was doing Infants on Thrones. My mom started listening, and she and her husband eventually left the church. My younger sister, who's 10 years younger than me, she left the church. My brother, who's 5 years younger than me, he left the church in high school, so it was never really a thing. My dad's still in the church, he and his wife. They're very faithful, and they know that I do the podcast, but they've tried to listen a couple times. They just can't. It's something we just really can't even talk about. And I approached my dad with a list of things. I think it's fairly common for people to write a letter. Mm-hmm. And try because there's so much information swirling around. You just want to get your hands around it and just try and get it all in one place, which is, I think, what Jeremy Reynolds did with the CES letter.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I did something similar, and I wrote down a bunch of things. I think there were like 46 things that I don't like about the church. And then I tried to balance it out with as many things as I did like about the church, but I think I only came up with maybe 32. So I wasn't able to like evenly balance it out. And I sent it to my dad as an email because I was living in Tokyo at the time. I lived in Tokyo from 2007 to 2010, and this was going on there then. And my dad was just really offended because he didn't have that emotional distance between himself and his beliefs. And he saw that what I was doing was challenging his beliefs, AKA challenging him, saying, I don't like these things, so therefore I don't like you. And he wasn't helpful at all. He just got hurt, and then he got kind of sarcastic, but in the very dismissive kind of, oh, you think I'm an idiot kind of way. Like, no, I don't think you're an idiot. And he's like, you think I haven't ever struggled with these questions? I'm like, great. How did you tell me? Talk to me about it. Yeah. And so that was just a failed experiment. We've never even tried to revisit it. So we just always have kind of, pretty superficial conversations when we get together, which is sad, but it's about as deep as we can go.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions, is when you kind of pursue something that's so kind of in your face, or so like what I'm doing with the subscription right now, and being able to step into a place of, I coach people who are transitioning out of the church.
Yeah.
When I still have family members that are still in. And so they don't want to know what I do. They have their own picture about what it is I do. They don't realize that a lot of it is just helping people learn higher order coping skills.
Yeah.
And I'm not really talking bad about church. I'm just helping them unpack some things that aren't healthy and help them develop more skills. And it's better for everybody. It helps them heal relationships with their family. And so they don't want to know that part. They just feel like any push I give, like you said, is a push against them, because I am the church. Our identity is so enmeshed that we can't differentiate between ourselves and the church. And it feels so offensive to us. And so have you experienced any, like when you do Infants on Thrones, do you get a lot of pushback, and like, what are you, the spawn of Satan kind of thing?
No, I've never, I'm sure that exists, but I don't really ever hear it. And I think it's another one of those things, like with the self-deprecating humor, that I might be expecting or anticipating that it's out there, when really, who's listening to Infants on Thrones? Like when I moved back to Arizona 3 years ago, I got a personalized license plate, which is TBM WSPR, TBM Whisperer, because that's what they call me on the podcast. But I'm the TBM Whisperer because I'm always taking the side of the TBMs. And so I thought, all right, this might be a risk. Am I going to have people throw eggs at my car because I'm the TBM? Nobody knows what it means.
Nobody is so cryptic. They wouldn't know what it was.
No,
I've had they fit in the TBM category.
Yeah, I've had a couple of people who listen to podcasts tell me, "Oh, I saw you there the other day," or something like that, which is nice. But I don't feel like I get demonized as a result of it. And if I have, I haven't felt it. But I had this thought as you were talking about people that are transitioning out of the church and trying to heal relationships with family members. And I don't really know much about coaching. I'm interested in finding out more about it and what you're doing with it. But it would seem to me, from my experience at least, I've really had to learn how to just be comfortable with myself, regardless of any relationships that I have with anyone else, and kind of let go of the efforts that I try to make to control or manipulate the way that people respond to me.
Yeah.
I've just got to be authentic, and I've got to be okay with that, with who I am and how I'm doing things. And because there's family relationships that I'd like to have. Like I've got an uncle who, he's only 5 years older than me, but he was a stake president at like 35. He went on a mission as a mission president. And I recently reconnected with him and had these grand ideas to like do podcasting with him, where, here I'm on the outside, he's on the inside. We could have these really healing conversations. And he's like, whoa, no, and like, I'd love to do that. And I'd love to have, I was having lunch with him and he's like, what can we do to be closer? We've got to have things in common. I'm like, we've got one thing really big in common. He's like, what's that? The church. Like I still spend so much of my time and energy and focus on things that have to do with the church. And the lessons that I learned in the church, the principles of the gospel, if that's what you want to call it, love, charity, forgiveness. I totally am a convert to those things. I totally believe in those things. Can we find common ground and, like have a better relationship, and then maybe do some podcast episodes about it? I think it was too much too quick with him, but I don't feel like there's hostility from him, but there's kind of an arm's distance, like, concern. And, so I don't know what to say to people who want to have a good relationship. But I think it's really about self-mastery.
Yeah, I agree.
Self-love, self-mastery,
and self-awareness, and mastering your emotional well-being and your emotional fluency, and expanding your willingness to see things in different ways.
Yeah.
So, what What are some of the things that, okay, let me figure out which question I haven't asked you.
Okay.
Okay, here's a question. What is intrinsically different about who you are today in comparison to who you were when you were really active in church?
Intrinsically?
Yeah. So not that, I have a beer here and there and I cuss. Really, what is different about your personality today than when you were in church?
I don't know. I'm more free to be who I want to be, and I've removed a lot of the obstacles that were just creating a lot of pain for me to try and be who it's like the square peg in the round hole kind of thing. I've found other square holes that I can be a square peg in, places where I fit better. I think that's the biggest difference. I'm not, I'm not as miserable as I was feeling just that tension, that cognitive dissonance. So I think there's a much greater sense of peace. I think my purpose in life at this point is to be the eye of any storm. That's kind of what I want to do. So anytime there's like conflict that rages around me, and there's a lot, to just try to be more calm about it. And
to just be the observer rather than always the participant. But I like what you said in that there's not much intrinsically different about your personality. You're still inquisitive. Yeah. Still want to do the right thing. Yeah. You're still an explorer. Yeah. You're still going to use humor. You're still fascinated with folklore. Yeah. You still want to connect with people. And there's not anything that now that you've untethered from the doctrine that causes you to be have a bad or malicious kind of attitude or propensity to do bad things.
Now, you're the one who introduced me to the Enneagram.
Yes. And that was my next question. What are some of the things that you've used to kind of satiate your desire for truth and more development? Yeah. Well,
the Enneagram I found really interesting as an indication of these innate qualities that you're talking about before. So I'm a 7 on the Enneagram. And I don't know if you remember, it was probably about 1.5 years ago when we sat down and you first told me about the Enneagram. Mm-hmm. And you just did kind of like a quick rundown of the different 9 types. And I'm like, I think I might be this one. I think I might be this one. I think I'm all of them, Wendi. As I studied more, I went, okay, yeah, I'm a 7. And I can recognize the reasons why I am that way. And I'm more that way now, even than I was 1.5 years ago, because as I've studied that and I've gone, this makes sense. The way that I have, because the way that I've come to understand the Enneagram is that there's always multiple options on how you could respond to anything around you or what you could focus your attention on. And there's certain reasons why you focus your attention in certain areas, and then it becomes a habit that you do over time. And it's kind of like I've heard the analogy of a dog in a big grassy backyard that wears tracks in the yard, and you just see these tracks. So like the dog could go anywhere, but it follows these particular tracks every once in a while. And we do that with our attention, and that's partly how our personalities form. And so I think your question about how am I innately different than now is just that I'm more comfortable with those choices, with those worn paths, and not feeling like, they need to be straight and narrow, or it needs to be only over here. I'm not able to focus on this. I'm not allowed. I can be who I am and then kind of grow from that and expand from that. But first accept where I'm starting from. Yeah. So the Enneagram has been helpful that way. I think some of the most influential people to me, Jonathan Haidt, his book, The Righteous Mind, The Coddling of the American Mind is his most recent book. That one's a good one too, but The Righteous Mind is just fantastic. Yuval Harari with the book Sapiens, that really changed the way that I can't say it changed the way that I view fictions, because it reinforced what I already kind of intuitively felt and then learned as a folklorist, that fictions, like a religious fiction, a myth, a religious myth, it binds people together, and it plays a very important function. And so instead of being on that side of the fence that is saying, oh, religion is bad, religion is just horrible, it's the root of all evil in the world, like, no, actually it kind of binds people together and is really, really important.
Yeah,
and
there's a purpose
away from it.
Yeah.
Like where I see a real value in what you're doing with people is like when you walk away from those ties that are binding you to your social group, what do you have? You know, you're severing these connections. How do you reconnect? That's hard to do. It's really hard to do. I don't have an answer for that.
But my experience has been connecting to yourself first. And that's like unplugging all of these things, hoping that when the time comes that there's something left over. What you find as you unravel it is it's you. And then you're like, well, okay, this is the relationship I want to have. And you can start plugging it in and become the sovereign authority of your own life.
Yeah.
Not realizing how many layers and just so many expectations that are put on you, and conditioning and all of this, not realizing that we're living everybody else's life but our own.
Yeah.
And so there comes that time where like, who am I really, when I don't have all of these layers of imposed beliefs and conditioning.
And I think the one of the most important things that I've learned through experience along those lines is that if I'm constantly trying to tailor myself to meet other people's expectations to get their approval, then I'm also constantly afraid that I'm going to fall short of those expectations and lose their approval. And so there's that fear and anxiety that's always just like a constant buzz there. But if I don't focus on that, and I just focus on like living my values and being who I am, and I'm either accepted or rejected by people, then the people who accept me, I'm like, oh, well, you accept me for who I am. And I'm always going to be who I am. So I don't have to worry about that going away, losing them. And those are the really important relationships. And then the ones that expect me to be someone different than who I am, I may want to be with them for reasons that, may or may not be great, but that just is a big source of stress. And I think that's, again, I don't know that I have a solution for that, but I've become much more comfortable with just, if you don't like me, you don't like me. That's okay. That's cool.
Well, and I found when I was transitioning that I really was afraid of losing everybody.
Yeah.
And the only one that you really don't lose is yourself, but you do stand to lose. I mean, if you're very enmeshed and your whole family is enmeshed in the church and your spouse is enmeshed, there's a possibility that you could lose that connection with everyone.
Yeah.
And so you have to come to this place of, am I willing to do that to discover myself?
Yeah.
Am I willing to hurt everybody else in order to stop betraying who I am? It's huge.
And is me being who I am really hurting other people?
Yeah. All of that means that who I really am is so insufficient and so inferior that I'm going to be rejected by everybody.
Yeah. Like if they expect me to believe something in order to be accepted, and I really don't believe it, but I pretend that I do, does not pretending anymore, is that really an act of violence towards them? Or is it just me? I'm sorry, you guys, I really just don't believe this.
Yeah.
But yeah, you do have to suffer the consequences for that. Which is why Martin Luther King and the letters from Birmingham jail is another thing I would put in the list of influencers, along with Alan Watts. I've been devouring for a year and a half just a ton of Alan Watts lectures. I can't get enough Alan Watts.
He's good.
Love him.
Yeah, I like that too. What do you regret or wish that you had done differently about your transition? Like, did you have an interaction where you're like, oh, that didn't go so well? Or what would you do differently?
Well, I mean, The one that I described with my dad is probably the biggest, but I don't know that
You could have done it any better.
I don't think you can. I don't think you can do it without conflict, and I don't think you should do it without conflict, because conflict is the teacher. The pain and the all of that stuff. It's the teacher, and you got to go through those experiences to learn from them. And you might have to go through it more than once to keep learning from them. So I don't know that there's really anything that I have like these big regrets. I've enjoyed my faith crisis. I've enjoyed making the podcast. I've enjoyed, it's been a really nice creative outlet. And it was one of my frustrations in church, because I wanted to talk about these things and I didn't have anybody to talk to in church. But I took it online with podcasts and find people who are interested in talking with me about it and listening to it being talked about. And so create this virtual community in this virtual group that has, like most of the people, I mean, because Infants on Thrones at its height a couple of years ago, we were probably getting 13,000 downloads per episode. Now it's closer to 5 or 6, but I don't know most of these people.
Yeah.
but they're interested.
Yeah.
And they keep tuning in. And so I feel like, okay, good. I've got a place to share what I'm thinking, and then get feedback from other people. Like when we do listener essays, or it's really nice when people send emails and other kinds of messages. And I've been able to meet a few people in person from time to time, and that's always nice as well. But I don't know that I have
no regrets.
I don't like saying no regrets, because I think that sounds pretentious, but I accept all of the things all the mistakes that I've made. And if I didn't make those mistakes, I would have made other ones. And that's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah. I think that's a healthy outlook.
Awesome. I'm healthy.
So, and yeah, I'm healthy.
Healthy.
How do you know if you're healthy? Well, I'm happy. So my vision, in closing, my vision and belief is that the greatest threat to the current LDS church isn't its shady history, and it isn't their cult-like practices, and it isn't their continuous appearance on the wrong side of social issues.
Yeah.
I actually believe it's the growing body of thriving and productive and happy, healthy post-LDS members of the church. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's a threat.
I think
no. I mean, so like, why do you frame it as a threat to the LDS church?
It's interesting you asked that, because that is the word that I've been going, I need to fix this word because it didn't feel right to me. But when members who are really active in believing start seeing a large body of people who have tremendous coping skills, and they're happy and they're living productive lives, it's to me that creates more cognitive dissonance than reading history, because I read the history over and over and I still was able to manipulate it back into making the church true. But when I see somebody living a happy, directed, fulfilling life, that's when I'm like, how can you do that when you don't have the gospel?
Yeah.
And so that's why I say that. But I do need to open up to how can I arrange the word that maybe it's just like the subtle change, or that I'll have to work on it. But
maybe I guess my thoughts is that I think that the church plays an incredibly valuable role in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people's lives, and
did in mine for sure.
Yeah. And it still does in mine. It just does it in a very, very different way than it used to before. One of the things that was really influential to me over the last few years is a guy named Emile Durkheim. Have you heard of Durkheim?
No.
Durkheim was a French philosopher. I think he lived 1870s, 1880s, something like that. But he witnessed the French Revolution. So when was that? When was the French Revolution?
Oh, don't ask me history.
I don't know.
I have no idea.
But he witnessed the impact of atheism on the population of France. He himself was an atheist, but he noticed that among the subset of the population that were atheists, there was an increase in depression, an increase in suicide, and he predicted that as the world became more secular, which was a response to, you know, like the abuses of power that you see in monarchy, where they say God is the one that gives me authority to yoke you, and people say, no, we don't believe in God, aka we don't believe you have the ability to yoke us, which is the birth of atheism.
Yeah.
That as people become more secular, there's this hole that's not being filled. And what Durkheim, there's a great TED talk that's Jonathan Haidt, I think it's called The Ecstatic Religious Experience. And Jonathan Haidt talks about this in the TED talk. He talks about Durkheim said that people are homo duplex. We have a dual nature, the sacred and the profane. And the profane is when you take care of your own self needs. And that's, I don't know why I call it profane. And then the sacred is more elevated. It's the realm of the group. Communal connection. And he talks about in times of war, you know, soldiers, when they feel really inspired that they're going to, it's not about themselves individually. It's about who they're fighting with, their brothers and sisters in arms, or who they're fighting for. And so when you go more secular, you don't really have anything to fill that sacred space, that connection, because that's what religion has been doing for so long. Mm-hmm. That's the role that it's been filling. And humans have co-evolved with this institution to fill this need where, you know, how many hundreds of thousands of years were we in small communal groups of like 100 to 150 people that were bound together by our shared mythology. And we've evolved to expect that. And so I think Mormonism does an awesome job of filling the realm of the sacred for these homo duplex people that need that. They need the sacred, they need the profane, and Mormonism does a really, really good job on that. So I don't know that a threat to Mormonism
is a great idea or a great endeavor.
I don't know that it's really even relevant. I don't know what it means, you know, like, so what, the Mormon church is going to fail? Or I think with every person who leaves the Mormon church has succeeded, because the Mormon church, in my case, in my case, it became the grist for the mill. It was the stone that my knife was sharpened against.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
And so I can look at the Mormon church without having any kind of anger or animosity towards it, or for me, what's more is like the arrogance, the superiority, and the looking down, like, I know more than you people do. You know, that's been my big struggle. And that was a struggle that I had when I was attending, and I would look at people and think, oh, you're stupid. And I didn't like thinking that. I didn't like feeling that. So I see the church now as playing an incredibly valuable role in the lives of its members. And when somebody is converted to the principles of the gospel, like love and charity, and then they see hypocrisy, and they're brave enough to stand up and go, you know what, I'm going to stand for love. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to stand for bigotry masked as love. I can see through that, and I'm willing to accept the social consequences of standing up and speaking my mind. It's incredibly brave. And so for somebody who's been able to do that, to just take a moment and hug themselves and just love themselves for what they've done, and recognize that, you grew up in a culture where you got that validation largely from other people around you, your leaders, authority figures, parents, patting you on the head when you do the right thing. Well, be that for yourself, and you know what the right thing is, and you're doing it. So I guess I don't really think of threats to the Mormon church as very helpful for the way that I look at it. I'm happy for the Mormon church to continue to be strong and continue to do what it's doing. And they do a lot of good for a lot of people. And they also, create a lot of conflict.
Well, it still becomes the arena, whether you're in or out, whether you've transitioned out or you're still growing within it. It's still the arena in which we're all growing, and some of us are using it as the backdrop, and some of us are just diving hard into the pool. And but wherever we are on the landscape of the Mormon, arena, it's still helping us to grow, whether we're looking at why it's not true and why it's not working for me, or why I need to move on because church attendance isn't working for me. You're still learning, you're still growing regardless of whether you're attending.
Yeah. And it can be incredibly painful to go through that. And, so to your question about emotions, there was times I felt a lot of pain. Times I felt very alone. I remember being called into a bishop's office once, being told that I need to be careful with what I say around people because not very many people can balance, like I used to feel like Atlas carrying the shoulder, the world on his shoulders, that like, of course, doubt's good. Doubt makes your faith stronger.
Doubt, they're like, no, we're not supposed
dumbbells. And he's like, yeah, most people doubt just crushes them. And so you got to be careful with that. It's a really lonely place to be where you are and shut up, basically, is what he was telling me in a nice way.
Yeah.
But
I love what you've done to make it not lonely.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you.
It's not a lonely place for you anymore because you've collected voices that were, and people who were having the same experience of you, because you were willing to be brave enough to cross that line and say, I'm just going to say what I'm feeling, and I'm going to voice some things. And if you agree, great. If you don't, then move along.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
I like how, to me, it's very healthy. So any other advice that you have for people who are transitioning out?
Just be easy, like be kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that, as I was mentioning different tools that have helped, I think is it Dr. David Burns, who's the one that does the cognitive, behavioral therapy. I think there's a book called Feeling Good that he wrote. Let me look it up real quick. But he talks about cognitive distortions that we have, these different thought patterns, like catastrophic thinking or all or nothing thinking, or just these different things that the culture that we're raised in can have an impact on the way that we see ourselves and the way that we see other people in the world around us. So if you can learn your own cognitive distortions, because we all have them. The book is called Feeling Good, The New Mood Therapy by David D. Burns. It's fantastic. It's great to be able to start recognizing, oh, I'm doing it. I'm doing all or nothing thinking. I'm discounting the positive again. Oh, I'm catastrophizing. So if you can start learning how to do those things, paying attention to that in your own life, and be kind to yourself.
Yeah. As you become the observer of your mind, and you see that wild, undisciplined mind, when you start looking at it, be kind. I agree.
And become the author, because if you're one of those ex-Mormons that goes, oh, everything in Mormonism is BS, it's all just a bunch of BS, then okay, well then what is truth? Where is truth? If meaning can be created through fictions, what's your fiction? What story are you going to tell? And if you think that you're not telling yourself stories, you've got some things to learn, because we're all stuck in our own stories, and they're stories. They're all fictions. Everything is a fiction. So I've got this new theory of everything that's called the Rorschach theory of everything, where I it doesn't really matter what it is to me. The real value in looking at something isn't how true it is, but it's what you make of it.
Yes. You're the one that creates the meaning.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean that there aren't facts that you can just change the facts in your mind. No, but it's your response to these things. And I think too often people are looking at these, like whether it's scripture or beliefs or teachings, that they all have to be in conformity with each other, and that conformity is the real standard for truth. And so we're worried about getting the most precise Rorschach ink blot and making sure that my ink blot is the one and true ink blot. But it's just how are you responding to it? It's so different for every single person.
Yes.
And accepting that and loving other people when they're differences. And yeah, that's my advice.
Well, I love your religion.
Thank you.
Your religion.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us.
You're welcome.
Baby, come back. Any kind of fool could truly see there was something in everything about you. Baby, come back. You could blame it all on me. I was wrong.
Hello, brothers and sisters. This is Elder E. Eldon Elderman of the 7th Quorum of the 70. When I'm not interviewing children about their masturbation practices, I monitor the Infants on Thrones podcast for the Strengthening the Members Committee. If you really like what you hear, you can jeopardize your eternal salvation by giving the Quorum a 5-star rating and writing a short review on iTunes. I didn't, but that's because I want to be resurrected with my genitalia intact. Anyone for the closing prayer?
Baby, come back. Any kind of fool could truly see there was something in everything about you. Baby, come back.
Thank you for listening to Infants on Thrones. Infants on Thrones.